he's pointing out that SMEs are already using AI.
Yeah.
And this is already leading to productivity gains.
And as a result of the whole trade war thing, the tariffs now are very high in China for US products. So China have gone and started sourcing from other areas of the world.
And I guess also, if you're not sure about what interest rates are going to do or whether property prices are going to crash or not, then big investments get held back.
Roger makes a point about the property prices in the UK that he says will continue to rise.
Because we talked about this back in the COVID days as to how the savings rate had gone up, partly because people didn't have anything to spend their money on back then. Hello again.
Hello.
I'm back.
It's been a while, hasn't it?
Well, the audience don't know that because we recorded enough in advance.
Sneaky. Yeah.
People don't know I've been away.
Prepared. Been away.
Just come back with a bit more of a,
intrepid,
I was going to say suntan, but
wind tan.
Wind burn.
Intrepid explorations.
Yeah,
I hear.
had a couple of weeks off-grid.
Off-grid.
Up in the Arctic Circle, where there's not many phone masts.
More polar bears than phone masts.
There's 2,999 more polar bears than the one phone mast. Yeah, exactly.
So did you bag your polar bear? What
yeah,
people?
It's on the wall.
I was going to say what people who are listening won't be able to see is you're wearing your polar bear skin, like a Viking.
Lovely rug in front of the fire at home. No, that's all illegal these days. Can't do that. They're protected species.
Oh,
yeah.
Wink, wink, nod, nod. Yeah.
Unless you know the governor.
But
no, it's a good experience though, just
cool.
being off grid for a while. And
so you saw some polar bears. Saw some polar bears off by the sounds of it as well.
Yeah, we had a couple of close encounters. Exactly, camping in the wild, living out of stream water and that sort of thing. Takes you back. No, it's good.
So you took seriously episode 126, disconnected and off the grid.
Off the grid.
Road
Can I survive an internet outage?
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, I didn't have much internet.
Like to,
and funnily enough, the sky hasn't fallen in. You know that tinge of disappointment? You didn't come back and it's all chaos. Actually, everyone survived just well with it. In fact, some might even say slightly better.
No comments on this side of the booth.
Yeah.
But no, well, good.
So, yeah, back and ready to record another episode.
Excellent.
Here we go.
Yeah.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the SME Growth Podcast. We're up to episode 128 today. So thank you very much for joining us. This podcast is brought to you by Wellmeadow, and every week we try and come up with something interesting or useful for owners and managers of small and medium-sized businesses. And with me, as is often the case, is my partner in crime, Richard Buckle.
Hello.
Hello, Richard. Here we are again.
Here again.
You thought you got rid of me, but I managed to return
I'll be back
from my travels.
Yeah.
And I think we'll do an episode on that maybe next week, talking about going off grid a little bit and recharging batteries and the difference between 1 week off and 2 weeks off and internet.
Avoiding burnout stuff, No.
Yeah, and all the burnout stuff. But anyway, this week, episode 128, we're going to be talking about Roger Martin-Fagg, who's the economist that we often publish the forecast from.
Yep.
And he's just published his July 2025 forecast. So we thought we'd do a podcast about that. So we'll come back to that in a minute. But as is often the case, we'll run through the most recent episodes. So what were the last three that we did?
So I did actually write these down. I can't read my handwriting.
You can't read it.
So 127 was how healthy is your pipeline?
Yeah.
Or how holy is your proposal? Could be
it.
one or the other.
Yeah.
I think it was how healthy is your pipeline.
That rings more of a bell to what we talked about. I think we talked then about some key measures, both from the point of view of if you were going through a due diligence exercise in mergers and acquisitions, but also just generally, are you on the game?
And we've been doing a lot of work in HubSpot with this as well, haven't we? Developing dashboards around this.
We've done a lot for different clients.
Taking the putting that into action. So all good stuff there. 126 we touched on was disconnected and exposed. And that wasn't
we're talking there about the internet.
We're talking about the internet, not your camping experience. So if the internet outage happened, how would your company survive?
Could your company cope? And we're talking there not about your average business continuity, plane lands on the office type of thing, power cut, where you all have to go home or do something else. This is where the whole country's internet goes down, but all other power and services remain. So you can still use phones, perhaps, but not the internet. So this is where maybe some sneaky sub has cut a cable under
Cut a cable, yeah. Who knows what's going to happen?
Sea.
Svalbard Sea. And then before that, episode 125 was... Oh my goodness, it was the AI connector one, wasn't it? I can't
Data connectors. You really can't read it.
I really can't read it.
See, you laugh at us when we can't read it.
Oh my goodness, it's terrible.
Should have read it.
And I only wrote it 2 seconds ago as well.
Data connectors. So
Data
this is
connectors.
where ChatGPT can access HubSpot or your email or your calendar or your Dropbox and Box and OneDrive and all that, and do clever stuff with all that. Although I'm still up against that problem where you can only use a lot of it in deep research mode, and you only get 10 deep research requests per month.
So.
And I use mine in half an hour. And I'm waiting for the 11th of July
to start again.
Yeah. So episode 128, which is an easy darts finish, as you know, triple 18, triple 14, double 16, you know, as I'm sure you're often approaching the Oki thinking that combination.
Thinking that. I almost bought a tiny snooker table at the weekend from the charity shop to go with the dartboard that's outside in the garden under the car porch. And
surely a tiny snooker table is a pool table.
Well, it was kind of it was a little miniature juniors one.
Right.
I got quite excited about it, and Mrs. Buckle said
Mrs.
no.
B
She wasn't having any of it.
One.
She wasn't having any of it.
Too much more like.
Well, we had a bit. She reminded me of when we tried to have a family game of pool when we were in Andorra.
Oh dear.
And
did it all end in tears?
Well, the snow melted before we managed to fill.
Get a ball,
before we managed to sink all the balls. So I thought no.
Maybe stick to the dartboard.
Stick with the dartboard.
Yeah, you like anything that can be thrown and injure people.
Exactly.
Good for a bit of that. Good. And the other bit of loose end I've got to clear up for listeners who remember last week's episode. I don't know how we got onto the subject of bees.
Oh, I was talking about it because I was saying about how 80% go off and just do the job.
The waggle dance.
The waggle dance. And then only honeybees do the waggle dance. But 20% just go off-piste and...
the waggles where they mimic the route they've taken to find the pollen.
Yeah, and every second is a kilometre.
So only 1 kilometre in that
direction.
But 20% don't follow that.
20% just go off and do random stuff. And so we were talking about, well, should you be doing that in your business? How much are you innovating? How much are you know...
So I asked you the question, apropos nothing other than triggered by the thought about bees, as to whether there are more bees on the planet or stars in the galaxy. And we said we'd come back to this. So in case I've got any listeners that are hanging on this, or any listeners, apparently there are 400 billion stars in the galaxy. That's your starter. So now you've got to go, are there more or fewer? It's a higher or lower game. But given that there are apparently 100 million beehives in the world just for making bees for commercial use.
Wow.
And each of them has between 20 and 60,000 bees in. That takes you up into the trillions of bees already, not including the 20,000 species of wild bee.
Wow.
On top of that.
That's a lot of honey.
So by some measure, a lot more than stars in the galaxy.
Wow.
So we'll, there you go.
Pub
hopefully
quiz. If that comes up in a pub quiz somewhere.
And I'm sure some people have been sat there since last week's episode thinking, I can't wait to hear the answer to that. For all the rest of you, we'll get on to today's topic.
On, yeah.
So a quick briefer for you. Roger Martin-Fagg. What do we know about Roger Martin-Fagg? He's got a little bit of a synopsis-y thing. We've known him for a long time.
We have.
We used to invite him and still often do to Shrewsbury.
Academy of Chief Executives days, wasn't it?
Yeah, he was a regular speaker from the circuit. He did a degree in Leicester Uni, but I think he made his name in New Zealand, wasn't it?
New Zealand Treasury. Yep. And at the Bank of England as well.
Yeah, and the Bank of England. And I think he Cranfield or whatever, he does some lecturing it. But he's made his name now on the speaker circuit, and he gives this quarterly newsletter, which is quite popular.
Yep.
And a lot of people come to our website to get a look at it and see what he's saying. And as he says, if he was a perfect economic forecaster, he wouldn't be doing this for a living. He would have made a lot of money backing his own bets. So this is more about commentary, and he's very good at giving the economic rationale sometimes behind these things, isn't he? So we just thought it'll be available on the website anyway if people want to go and download it and read it. But we thought this is a good opportunity to do a podcast episode on it. We've done one before.
I think it's quite a good antidote to some of the stuff you read in the press as well sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah.
We always feel we get a lot of information from the press that is maybe got another agenda or... And I'm sure, we've all got our biases and things, haven't we? But it's nice to get a perspective from someone who's actually looking at the data and
Well, as he points
forming
out
an opinion.
later on in his newsletter, he works mostly with SMEs,
Yeah,
and yet government data and the media tends to talk to the big FTSE 100 companies,
Yeah.
and you get a very different picture.
yeah,
And he's always been a big champion of SMEs, hasn't he? He points out that 67% of the country's GDP is produced by GDPs, and
yeah.
17
The
million
ability to
employees.
innovate and the agility of an SME as well, isn't it? Really.
Yeah, shorter decision-making cycles, higher propensity to take risks as well, I think, in the aggregate. Sometimes.
Yeah, I
for
like
the
what
long
he's
run.
saying about how whilst the focus groups that the government are talking
Yeah.
to are talking,
Yeah.
SMEs have already done it, moved on,
Yeah.
iterated a few times, and
Those saying it can't be done should get out of the way. The people are already doing it.
Exactly.
Exactly. So yeah, he gives a good perspective on that. But he does a little bit of around the world summary, doesn't he? He talks about each of the countries and what he thinks the outlook is for that. But I should point out that we're recording this 2 days before the US's proposed global tariffs come into force. They were delayed from a couple of months ago to July the 9th,
Yeah.
which is the Wednesday of the week that we're recording in. So by the time this lands, it will be yesterday. So who knows what happened? The clever money says that there possibly be a further delay to at least the 1st of August. So push it out again and maybe a softening of it. But he points out, and I've not picked up on this before, that the bond market calls the Trump whole shenanigans TACO, T-A-C-O. Trump always chickens out. TACO. So I think they're working on the basis, because funny enough, the markets haven't gone crazy. And you think we're 2 days away here from potentially 50 to 75% plus tariffs being imposed globally by the world's largest economy, and nobody's really reacting. And the equity markets haven't collapsed.
Well, that's probably because he doesn't know that's what they call him.
Do you think if they did,
So I think if he did, then yeah.
he'd send in the
So
National Guard?
mum's the word.
You don't tell him. Don't tell anybody that Roger Martin-Fagg has called him a name
Exposed it, yeah.
in his quarterly newsletter.
So,
All right, good. So we're going to talk a bit about that. And in the context of these things, these tariffs, what interesting, the commentary that Roger Martin-Fagg came out was it's all tied in part with this new bill that's gone through, the one big beautiful bill or whatever it was, which proposes a massive increase again to the US deficit. And it points out there that there's a bit of small print in it, which I can read this here. That it says, been noticed by the bond markets. It says that there's a clause that allows the president to, if necessary, tax capital inflows and instruct the Federal Reserve not to be the lender of last resort, which for decades now it has been. So that has spooked the bond markets a little bit and caused a little bit of a flight to away from dollar and into euros and gold. So we'll see how that plays out. But the thing is, there's so much noise happening at the moment that the dollar rate is going up and down all over the place based on the last bit of news. And the other thing he talked about on these tariffs themselves is that because it's on goods and not services, poorer people are hit more by that because they spend a larger proportion of their income on goods, whereas richer people tend to spend more on
services.
Combine that with the one big beautiful bill, which is so stuffed full of pork barrel politics to look after all the different special interest groups. And they're saying that the top 10% of Americans will gain by $8,000 a year, and the poorest 10% will lose $2,000 a year. So
Sounds
all
like
those voters who thought they were going to sort it all out and look after your average working man, your poor man, going to be a bit disappointed.
Sounds like it's a job for Richard Hood.
Do you think you could have a little career there in politics?
Riding through the... I don't know, I thought about it once.
Just once?
My granddad was always quite keen on me to go into politics. I'd be firm but fair.
Would you be an independent?
Oh, I don't know.
Or would you be a Faragista?
I don't know.
Probably getting a bit too
Probably too
close for our
exposing
audience
my... Yeah.
We don't want to lose our half our audience by declaring a political view.
Reform from the inside, maybe. I don't know. No pun intended. I don't know.
Well, stay tuned then, folks.
I think you get more done if you could just be the boss. If I could just be the boss.
We just need a dictatorship, really.
Benevolent dictator. I'd be a benevolent
I think
dictator.
all dictators think they're benevolent. some less so
They
than
just
others.
get stuff done.
Yeah.
So
But you need to be in charge.
I'll tell you a funny story about this. So my daughter, we were up in Edinburgh, and she kept seeing all these stickers for Arnold Clark.
Yeah.
and she thought that Arnold Clark was a local politician that was
He drives a lot of cars.
that was looking to get elected, and everyone had their Arnold Clark stickers on their cars as a show of support. So she was most heartbroken when she realised that actually it wasn't a local politician. He's actually quite an old man. I think he's dead, actually, the actual Arnold Clark.
But his name lives on.
His name lives on. So she's going to write to them and tell them that story. See if she can get a free bumper sticker.
The company newsletter.
So if I'm driving around with an Arnold Clark sticker on the back of
what makes you think, though, is if you are now a politician, change your name to Arnold Clark.
Exactly.
Everybody will then think you've got a lot of supporters.
Look at all these people everywhere.
Yeah, they've all got his sticker.
So Arnold Clark, you've got our vote.
Just tell us when you stand.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, good. Well, thank you for that little light-hearted detour. Where else did we get to from Rogers?
So he was talking about rearmament as well, wasn't he? Because of
triggered by Trump, we're all supposed to spend a lot more on defence.
5% and all that kind of jazz on NATO, etc.
Yeah.
But he was saying how that is actually inflationary, isn't it?
Which took me by surprise, that. You think extra investment spending, you think that would help, spur the economy, but not necessarily be inflationary. But he explained a bit why. What was the reason again?
Well, he said it because it's making goods and services that consumers don't use.
And thankfully.
Unless they're in America, in which case they probably do.
They probably got it already.
But yeah, so a lot of, obviously ammunition becomes scrap pretty quickly once it's used and things like that. So he says it will boost GDP, but it will, it consumes resources. So more tanks is less cars.
And if you've got
that could be used in
capacity-constrained economy, number of employees, number of capital flows, and you start diverting more of it to defence, it has to come from somewhere.
Got to give, yeah. So,
but the main thing is you're creating stuff that just sits there, hopefully. Or if it does get used, you can't use it again. It blows up.
Yeah.
So that was an interesting perspective. If we are now, as it seems to be the case from the spending review, going to be spending a lot more on defence, and that's going to be the same in other countries, certainly around NATO, if not elsewhere.
Yeah.
Now he went on. He talked a bit about the savings rate as well. This is interesting because we talked about this back in the COVID days as to how the savings rate had gone up, partly because people didn't have anything to spend their money on back then. Yeah. And then we came out of COVID, and as everyone will remember, they had a bumper year or two in 22, 23 maybe. And Martin-Fagg himself said, whatever you do, put your 2024 budgets in place, assuming that 2023 will continue. Yeah. And loads of people we know did, and they all fell short. Yeah. And he was right, because it was just the unwinding of the savings rate. Now, what's happening now?
People are saving more.
People are saving more. Why is that?
But, well, I don't know. I mean, I think that sounds slightly counterintuitive to word on the street. Where people are spending more. They're saying, well, look, there might be a war next week. We might all be obliterated. So just go on that holiday, do the thing.
Oh, right.
So that's
that the word on your street?
That's the word on, well, that's what Mrs. Buckle tells me anyway.
Well, she's definitely got her ear to the ground.
She's, at least she's got her spending up. So, but no, other people we know and things are actually saying, let's, go on holiday whilst you can, do this stuff whilst you can. Yeah, because who knows what's going to happen around the corner. Gosh, this is real sort of Armageddon chat. Is that why people aren't having babies either? What's the point of investing 20, 30 years in the next generation? I think there's multiple reasons for that, isn't there? It's a whole podcast in and of itself. Yeah, possibly. But but I guess, I don't know. I mean, what? Well, apparently it's going up though. The word on your street says otherwise. Or maybe it's just Mrs. Buckle trying to persuade you that so she can go and buy something to replace the snooker table in your garden, which has just been vetoed. She had another plan for that space. Exactly. She wanted a water feature. Probably, yeah. But apparently savings rate's going up, triggered by more uncertainty, where people aren't sure. I can sort of get that. And I guess also, if you're not sure about what interest rates are going to do or whether property prices are going to crash or not, then big investments get held back. Well, Roger makes a point about the property prices in the UK that he says will continue to rise, which has been one of his predictions for quite a long time. So he says, that will just keep on going and going and going. Yeah, he links that through to yields on 10-year bonds, which those of us not tied into commercial property probably don't quite get. But the whole idea of commercial property has to have a risk premium over risk-free, so-called risk-free investments like 10-year bonds. And therefore, when those bond prices come down, the yields go down, and therefore the prices go up. But the opposite happens. So if 10-year bond prices go up, that means property yields have to go up, which means that prices come down.
get your head around all that. But
I did actually spend a bit of time once trying to get my head around the ups and downs of all of that.
Yield goes up, prices come down.
Price come down.
Yeah, it's just one of those things. Google it. ChatGPT.
ChatGPT is pretty good. ChatGPT is pretty good for it.
Yeah. Now, he also talked about in the context of these tariffs potentially coming in 2 days' time or delayed to the 1st of August or at some point, maybe whenever, that some behaviour changes are already happening. And I've got a couple of stories from our clients on this. One where the metal part, the aluminium part of the supply of a product is being taken out of the scope of supply and being supplied locally in the US.
Yep.
And then the rest of what the product is, which is a construction product, is being shipped across, but without the aluminium parts, just to get around it. And the other one I've heard about, which is where the tariff is being applied to where the steel is made.
Right.
And that's counted as where it's melted, not
Okay.
where it's formed.
Right.
Okay. So there's even a case where one of our clients, very high up in the world of bar furniture, they're talking now about getting the steel, American-made steel, shipped to their manufacturers in Europe to manufacture it and send it back again.
Okay.
Isn't that crazy that there's enough of a difference? But energy costs in the US are a quarter of what they are in the UK, half what they're in Europe, or thereabouts. So it's almost worth doing, which is surely not what anyone intended. Trump least of all. Okay, you'll increase the demand for American steel, but you're not onshoring the rest of it because that's still more productive to do elsewhere. But the other big problem, and I think we mentioned this in a previous podcast, is that Americans aren't clued up to this. They're getting these invoices from their Department of Homeland Security with the tariffs on, and they think it's a mistake and that it should be the supplier paying for it. And they haven't realised that this is a tax on them. That will happen. Right, quick look at the UK. What did he say about the UK?
Strong performance first quarter 2025. Real GDP grew by 0.7%.
Which is a 2.8% a year if you had 4 quarters like that. That did surprise me, I must admit. So that's well above forecast. Although he says that's going to soften, probably down to 0.3 or something in the second quarter.
Yeah.
And I think we've still got IMF forecasts of about 1.5% for the UK for the whole year. But yeah, strong first quarter of the year. I was quite surprised by that. Purchasing managers index was down.
Well, it says strong recovery until the tariffs, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was up. Then we had the tariffs, and it's gone down. So we'll have to see. It's below 50% or 50 marker, which is neutral, isn't it? As many optimists as pessimists. So that's not looking too good. Real wages are up though.
Yep, 2.8%.
But it's not flowing through to spend because of that savings rate we talked about, except for hospitality. So we're just all spending it on food and drink instead. But he also talked a bit more about the fiscal drag thing. Another reason why wages going up doesn't flow through to spend is because more are paying 40% tax.
Yeah.
And so that's causing all that. Now, he talked about the investment. In the spending review, there was 70 billion of investment announced. And he said there's something that hasn't been published yet, but it's been promised, which is an interactive map of the UK showing where that investment's going to go.
Yeah, and he's saying how that could actually be really useful for SMEs.
Yeah.
If you can see there's going to be a huge amount of investment in your area, you could start thinking about, do you scale up? How do you get involved?
Yeah. Where's the growth going to be?
Where's the growth going to be?
Where they're going to build the housing and where the job's going to be and all that stuff.
So eagerly await the map.
Yeah. Now, another thing he said about SMEs was around the subject of AI. And this is where he drew the contrast that you mentioned earlier on, that in these big companies, they're still thinking about it, whereas in smaller companies, they're already using it. And we'll touch on it next week in terms of the burnout thing and my experience of being 2 weeks off grid. But I've relied, more so than I realised, having come back, fearful of the tidal wave, bow wave of emails to respond to. But AI has been dealing with them all while I've been away.
Yeah.
Not responding, but triaging them all, putting them in the right folders. So I've known which to do. So he's pointing out that SMEs are already using AI.
Yeah.
And this is already leading to productivity gains.
Well, and he was mentioning as well around the sort of the, what was he still talking about? The job tax and things, wasn't he? And how...
Oh, the fact that employment is, unemployment rate isn't likely to go up.
Yeah. And that how everyone's blaming that on increasing employers' national insurance contributions. Why would you want to hire people? It's too expensive, et cetera, et cetera. And he was saying, well, actually, some of that may well be true, but there's actually a big component of that relates to increased AI usage amongst SMEs.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the motivator.
Well, we
Maybe
can believe that. I know
Yeah.
that we're not typical, but if at one end of a spectrum, we've seen our clients getting more and more into it. We talked before, didn't we, about the team edition
Yeah.
of ChatGPT and some of the functions that HubSpot's got within it, and my email triaging and meeting note takers and all that sort of stuff. Everywhere
Yeah.
it's creeping in now, whether you're using Microsoft's Copilot or other. And it really is taking out chunks of work.
And almost, you probably don't even think about it because it's becoming quite normal. If you had to write up meeting notes from a meeting, Fathom now does that.
Don't take notes anymore.
Don't take notes, and it's all there.
Yeah.
I've even got it integrated into ClickUp now, which was
It
quite
creates
useful.
that's right.
Creates the action,
It infers the actions from listening to the meeting,
goes in.
assigns the owner, puts
I
them
just
into
drop that into
wherever
the
you
right
want,
folder.
ClickUp, HubSpot,
Done.
Outlook.
And so there's probably all these marginal. If you can do 60 hours worth of work for 40,
Yeah.
you're doing all right, aren't you?
Indeed. Now, he talks a bit about the US-UK deal, supposed deal, which hasn't actually been ratified yet. And he points out that it only applies to the first 100,000 cars. Thereafter, the tax goes up and the cars coming in from America doesn't.
Right.
It's not been fully defined what steel and aluminium will be covered on it, and the pharmaceutical deal hasn't been ratified either. But we are going to be importing up to 13,000 tonnes of American beef and a load of ethanol.
Bit of a snack. Sounds good, that, doesn't it? Beef and ethanol.
Beef and alcohol.
That's our kind of tariffs.
We can have American beef and alcohol.
Hormone-free beef, though, he said.
But as he points out, and I think this is useful to say, it's easy to fall into a jingoistic pride that, at least the UK's got to deal with the US, unlike the EU. Thank goodness we left it. As he points out, economically, we'd be a lot better off if the EU had a deal with the US, and we didn't. Run the other way around, because the EU is 41% of our exports. So we want it to grow, because then we supply more to it. So we have a much bigger impact from the EU doing well than the other. So that's quite interesting. Now, he talks a bit about, I don't know why he was going with this, because he started talking about US farms. Did you read that bit?
I read that, yeah.
And I thought, where's he going with that? But he did sort of have a point, didn't he, about, but it goes back to taco again.
Back to taco and how, I think it was linked, if I was reading it correctly, to say that the US exports an awful lot to China.
Especially of agricultural.
Of agricultural goods, soy, soya, corn, that type of thing.
Yeah.
And as a result of the whole trade war thing, the tariffs now are very high in China for US products. So China have gone and started sourcing from other areas of the world. Brazil. So because most farms run on debt, then there's obviously this exposure of American farms. I think are quite different, aren't they? They have a lot more rural, local banks because there's
not local banks.
In America. So he's saying that they've potentially got an awful lot of liabilities unstated or uncrystallized yet on their books, because there may be a situation where if China have now found alternative supply for their agricultural products,
there's a delay.
Who are they going to sell to?
Isn't he saying that because the harvest doesn't happen until September, October, any switch of supply now is based on last year's stocks?
Yeah.
So you don't see the difference until this year's harvest can't suddenly be sold. So the price then crashes. And his point is that all these local banks then will go bust because the farmers won't be able to service their debt. So, there's a reading of the future here, which really chain reaction, a bit like back in the 2008 financial crisis.
Yeah.
Couldn't quite expect it the way it happened, but it happened anyway. And as he points out, an awful lot of those farmers are Republican supporters, unlike on the sort of coasts, which are more service-oriented economies.
So that would be an interesting one to watch. So,
and already US exports are down 5% this year, based on everything that's happening.
And tourism as well. So it talks about Canadian tourism is down 40%, which is probably,
Yeah, well, I think, didn't they have a campaign? Didn't Carney sort of lead a bit of a campaign saying, don't go to America? But 40% down, that's a big chunk. And 10% for the rest of the world. So people are turning their back a little bit.
Good time to go. You get a deal.
You could probably get a deal. Yeah, exactly. So as a result, his outlook for the USA economy is pretty grim. Their forecast for growth has come down again, 1.7 to 1.4. So they were the darling buds for a while, weren't they? America was really going like a train until Trump got in, partly because of Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. Was it Inflation Reduction Act? I think it was, wasn't it? Lots of investment going on there, and they were growing at ridiculous rates, and real wages were going up. But now real wages are even lower than growing anyway, even lower rate than in the UK. And Trump's popularity rating is the lowest of Obama and Biden at this time in the cycle. But there's a weird response as well he talked about. He said, why isn't it happening? He said, normally when the US stock market, the US stock market would take a pounding because of all these forward-looking indicators, and it's not. Normally there'd be a flight away from equities into bonds and gold, and it's not. The stock market's doing fine. So we can only conclude that the stock market just don't believe him. He's back to being taco again.
Yeah.
So summarise all that lot then. What does he conclude as a result of his quarterly newsletter?
Well, July 9th is a key day, so by the time this comes out, we'll know whether it is or not, won't we?
Yeah. So we should
key
say
either way, isn't it?
Yesterday was a key
Yesterday
date.
was a key day.
Well, isn't it key? Wasn't it amazing what happened? And we have to keep talking about it without
Maybe
actually referring to
maybe it was so key that the whole of humanity pivoted on this day, and this podcast doesn't even make it out because it's just triggered so many chain reaction events that
Well, we can stop now then.
we're episode 126 all over again. Internet outage, done.
We didn't even make it to 130. Got stuck at
Look at
128.
this. Or it could just pass on.
I think he'll kick it.
It'll kick the can down the road. Bit more negotiating, art of the deal stuff.
Yeah. He's going to send some letters out, he said.
So he's optimistic about the UK, which I say that does surprise me slightly.
But he often
not
is.
that he is, but that just from what you hear all the time in the media.
But that's his whole point, that the journalists are lazy, they're not reading the detail behind all of this
Well, I
stuff.
actually thought an interesting point that we've glossed over that he made was that he'd done quite a bit of work back in his college days around turnaround.
Oh, yeah, I read that.
In his business school, when he ran the turnaround strategy programs for FTSE 100 companies.
Yeah.
And so he's talking about how he worked with M&S, Sainsbury's and Lloyds Bank. It's in all three cases took 7 years to achieve the desired financial performance with plenty of mistakes on the way. So he says way too early to start judging anything yet.
Yeah. And he talks about in these big turnarounds, you spend the first couple of years just shoring up the balance sheet.
Yeah.
The next couple of years trying to change hearts and minds and culture, which is massive.
Yeah.
And then success follows maybe after the business model changes after that. But he is nevertheless, like you say, generally optimistic. He says it's going to be stronger growth in the fourth quarter in the UK as these infrastructure spends start to flow. He doesn't think interest rates are going to fall anymore.
No.
Now, there was a point earlier in the year that they were forecasting sort of 4 quarter-point cuts, weren't they? So for those exposed to interest rates out there, either debt or investment, that's interesting. Inflation, you reckon, will still stay about where it is. Unemployment will stop rising. That's the point you made about the...
But he says, that job losses will be due to technology rather than lack of sales.
Yeah, but then their losses, maybe they get transferred somewhere else. So people do stop working for one company but go and work somewhere else. And they're more productive. It's good. And the dollar will still weaken, he reckons. So those of you that have US trade, not saying bet on that piece of advice, but he's certainly thinking from a macroeconomic term that with all this uncertainty around in the US and with that small print being included in the one big beautiful bill, which says that the Fed cannot be the lender of last resort if they choose and to tax inflows, that ultimately the dollar will suffer as a result. And then he does a little footnote to say, haven't even covered this, but if the Straits of Hormuz are blocked off by the Iranians because they don't like being bombed, then given that what percentage of oil goes through that? A hell of a lot.
20%.
20% of the world's oil goes through there. Then they'll have to take it round north of Russia past Svalbard.
So that's why you were there.
I was
You
there,
were securing
casing it out.
Casing
out
the
northeast
trade route.
Well, with global warming, it's going to become even more important.
Did you put a flag down? A Wellmeadow flag?
There are. I should have done, actually, because there's lots of flags. 40 countries are all there anyway. It's the only country, I don't know the only country, but it is a country in the world where you don't need a visa to either live there or work there.
Yeah.
So you can get there. So you leave Oslo, Norway, to go to Norway, and you have to leave Schengen, even though you're still in Norway.
There you go.
But there you go. So there you go. That's thank you very much, Roger, for sending that through. That's going to be available on our website probably before you even listen to this. So have a look out for that, and you'll see the archive of all the previous ones he's been sending us over the last 15 years or more that we've been publishing his reports. And I hope you find that useful and thought-provoking, as I hope you find all the rest of our podcasts. So thank you very much again for listening to this one. Tell your friends about it. Pass on the word in the usual ways. And in the meantime, good luck with your business.